There's a moment when a pipeline stops being a pipeline. A moment when steel in the ground stops being just infrastructure and suddenly becomes leverage, a signal, a message sent across borders without a single word being spoken. And for Canada, that moment didn't arrive with a speech or a press conference. It arrived quietly on a Friday morning in Ottawa with the approval of a $4 billion project that most Americans had never even heard of.
What is becoming impossible to ignore is that the neighbor has finally realized their hand is still in our fridge. And we're about to shut the door. For years, Washington has treated Canadian energy as an entitlement.
Ally like a bargaining chip, Ottawa was quietly preparing something else entirely, a way out, a way around, a way forward that didn't need Donald Trump's permission at all. The project is called the Sunrise Expansion Program, and on the surface it sounds almost routine. Enbridge wants to add about 139 kilometers of new pipe to its existing West Coast system in British Columbia, built as 11 looping segments running parallel to infrastructure that has been there for decades. The cost is roughly $4 billion. The added capacity is around 300 million cubic feet of natural gas per day, a 17% increase on the existing T-South line. Construction begins in July 2026. The in-service date is late 2028. Those are the numbers. That's the technical summary. But underneath those simple numbers was something much larger. Because this pipeline doesn't just carry gas, it carries a strategy. A strategy that Mark Carney has been quietly assembling.
A northern extension of their own grid to be manipulated at will. But this week, the mask fell off. As the Trump administration ramped up the noise about tariffs and loyalty tests, Ottawa quietly approved a $4 billion project that changes the math forever. This is nuts. They think they can bully us with tariffs on one hand and demand cheap gas with the other? That's a bad trade, and the deal is over. We just approved the Sunrise expansion, and here's the kicker. It's not for them. It's for everyone else.
Sounds like a doctrine, a new posture, a declaration that Canada intends to stop shipping 97% of its gas across a single southern border and start sending it around the world. Now think about what that really means, because the West Coast pipeline system stretches roughly 2,900 kilometers from northeast British Columbia down to the Huntingdon-Sumas meter station at the Canada-US border. For decades, that infrastructure has carried Canadian gas into the American market on American terms, with American pricing, under American leverage. The Sunrise expansion doesn't just add pipe, it adds optionality. Because the same system feeds into Woodfibre LNG near Squamish, a net-zero export facility hosted on Squamish First Nation land that is being built to send liquefied natural gas to Asia. And that changes the entire equation. Because once that gas reaches tidewater, it stops being a North American commodity and becomes a global one. It can sail to Japan in days. It can reach South Korea, Taiwan, and eventually Europe. It can be sold into markets that are paying premium prices precisely because they are trying to diversify away from Russian supply and from American unpredictability. And that last part matters more than any tariff headline, because in capitals from Berlin to Tokyo, officials have started using a phrase they never used before about Canada's southern neighbor. They call the United States an unreliable energy partner. And that's the uncomfortable reality Washington is now facing. Because while Trump spent the past year threatening allies, banning Chinese vessels from U.S. ports, and pressuring Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan to pour money into a 1,300-kilometer Alaska pipeline project that most analysts consider commercially shaky, Canada was doing something simpler. It was finishing a route that already makes sense. No bluff, no pressure campaign, no $44 billion political negotiation.
The sucking sound you hear isn't Canadian jobs moving south, it's the sound of American leverage vanishing into the Pacific. The playbook being run against us is transparent, but it's failing. They bellow about energy independence, they bully allies into shaky Alaska pipeline deals, and they believe we'll fold because we've historically had nowhere else to go. They suck at strategy. They spent a year calling us a national security risk while relying on us to keep the lights on in Washington State and Oregon.
That agreement alone would have been historic. Paired with the Sunrise approval, it starts to look like something much bigger, a doctrine. And the doctrine has a name, even if Ottawa avoids saying it out loud. It is called diversification. It is the deliberate, systematic unwinding of Canada's over-reliance on a single customer that keeps threatening to punish it for existing. Because when your largest trading partner spends 18 months calling you a cheat, a free rider, and a national security risk, you stop treating the relationship as permanent. You start treating it as conditional. And once that shift happens inside a country's energy planning, it almost never reverses. Inside Ottawa, this didn't feel like retaliation. It felt like survival, because Canadian officials had watched for months as Trump swung from threats to tariffs to exemptions and back again, turning the border into a negotiation table that never closed. Steel tariffs, aluminum tariffs, auto tariffs, softwood lumber, dairy, potash. Every industry pulled into the spiral, and every week the same lesson reinforced itself in the minds of ministers, premiers, and CEOs. You cannot build a national economy around a partner who treats every handshake as a renegotiation. But here's where the story turned in a way almost nobody expected, because the Sunrise approval didn't just come with a pipeline. It came with something Canada has spent decades fumbling: Indigenous partnership, real, structural, equity-based partnership. Not symbolic consultation,
You
not
can't
a
treat
press
your
release.
gas station like a punching bag and expect the pumps to stay open on your terms. The pattern is clear. They're desperate. And we've stopped asking for permission. And before we break this down further, please subscribe to Canada Policy for clear, in-depth analysis on the moments shaping Canada's future. Hard assets and global optionality. This isn't just a pipeline, it's forward guidance. The Sunrise expansion adds 300 million cubic feet per day to our West Coast system. But here is the pivot. This gas is headed for Woodfibre-Aleng, a net-zero facility on Squamish land. Once that gas hits Tidewater, it stops being a North American commodity and becomes a global weapon. Time is on our side because we have the hard assets. We have the lowest carbon footprint aluminum on the planet and now the cleanest ling in the world. Japan wants it. South Korea wants it. Europe is begging for it. We're moving from a forced dependency on one fickle customer to a mutual symbiosis with the entire G7.
Development was almost lazy. It assumed Canada couldn't build anything. It assumed Ottawa's internal politics would strangle every major project. It assumed that whenever Canada tried to diversify, the same old fights would flare up and the same old delays would take hold. That assumption is now being tested in real time, and so far it is being proven wrong, because the Sunrise expansion is expected to add more than $3 billion to Canada's economy, create roughly 2,500 construction jobs, and generate more than $700 million in federal and provincial tax revenue. And it is doing all of that while hooking directly into a liquefied natural gas terminal that is deliberately being engineered as net zero for export, giving Canadian gas a premium branding in a market where carbon profile has started to matter as much as price. That is not a coincidence. That is positioning. At the same time, Europe is no longer whispering about Canadian LNG. Europe is asking for it directly. Germany has built 4 new LNG terminals since 2022. European imports hit near record highs this past winter, and half of Europe's LNG still comes from the US Gulf Coast, which means that every time Trump escalates a tariff fight, every time he rattles NATO, every time he floats the idea of using energy as a pressure tool, European officials quietly ask the same question: who else can sell us gas with long-term reliability? And Canada, for the first time in a generation, has an answer that doesn't start with an apology. And this is where the geopolitics gets interesting, because Carney's government has passed the Building Canada Act, Bill C-5, giving Cabinet the power to fast-track projects of national interest. The Sunrise approval is one of the first clear signals of how that law will be used. Not for small local projects, for strategic ones, for projects that reposition Canada inside the global energy map. Ministers are now hinting at expansions at the Port of Churchill in Manitoba, Canada's only deepwater Arctic port, potentially turning it into an LNG gateway to Europe through the Hudson Strait. They are looking at Montreal, at the East Coast. at options that didn't exist on any serious planning document 5 years ago.
If Trump wants to rattle the cage, let him. We're busy building the exit ramp. Canada needs to understand that diverting gas to Asia will spike prices for American consumers. That will have consequences. Consequences? You started a trade war. You don't get to dictate where we sell our resources while you're trying to poach our steel industry. That's not how a partnership works. And do not forget subscribe to Canada Policy for updates on Canadian news. We expect priority access to the T-South line. Expectations don't pay for pipelines. Capital does. And global capital is moving to Canadian reliability. We aren't taking instructions from an unreliable partner anymore.
For Canada is deeply uncomfortable for Washington, and that discomfort is layered. The first layer is obvious. Every molecule of Canadian gas that sails out of Squamish is a molecule that doesn't cross into Washington state through the Huntington-Sumas meter station. The U.S. Pacific Northwest has relied on Canadian gas imports for decades. A tighter Canadian export posture means higher prices for American consumers in Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. That is not theoretical, that is physics. The second layer is harder to measure, but far more important, because the United States has spent 40 years building an implicit assumption into its energy security doctrine, the assumption that Canadian resources are essentially a northern extension of the American market, that Alberta crude flows south, that British Columbia gas flows south, that Saskatchewan potash and uranium and critical minerals all move into American supply chains on predictable, cheap, cross-border terms. That assumption is now fracturing in front of everyone. And once it fractures, it cannot be patched with a phone call.
You want our gas? Compete for it like everyone else. BC loops to the world. This battle is won in the 139 kilometers of new pipe looping through northeast BC, and the equity deals signed with the Stonelace 8 Indigenous Alliance.
And the growing talk of Atlantic LNG exports all point in the same direction. A country that has spent years being told it cannot build is suddenly behaving like a country that intends to. And for the markets, that shift is already visible. Enbridge stock has responded positively through 2026. Canadian energy producers are reporting stronger long-term offtake interest from overseas buyers. Bank of Montreal and RBC analysts have begun modeling Canadian LNG as a structurally growing category rather than a marginal one. And international ratings agencies are beginning to recognize that diversified export infrastructure strengthens Canada's sovereign risk profile in a way that 2 decades of oil sands dependence never did. All of this creates a kind of pressure that's hard to describe unless you step back and look at the full picture. Because what's happening here is part of a much bigger pattern, one in which middle powers like Canada, Australia, and the Gulf states are quietly repositioning themselves as the preferred suppliers for a world that no longer wants to bet its entire energy security on a single superpower. Trump's tariff doctrine was supposed to bring allies closer. In practice, it has given them every reason to build parallel networks that don't depend on the United States at all. And for companies like Enbridge, TC Energy, Cenovus, and Suncor, the Sunrise approval is being read as a template that's...
By making First Nations co-owners, we've removed the internal friction Washington used to rely on to stall our progress. The Americans assumed our internal politics would strangle us. They were wrong. We've built a new model of Indigenous equity that they can't touch. From the Port of Churchill to the BC coast, the infrastructure is moving. It's a structural shift that can't be patched with a phone call. The Trump administration assumed Canada was a captive market. They've spent 18 months proving why they can't be trusted. And we've spent 18 months building the alternative. Canada is the adult in the room. We are calm, we are diversified, and we are no longer waiting for a green light from the South. We are an energy superpower, and we're finally starting to act like it. Subscribe to Canada Policy for daily coverage of the decisions shaping Canada's future.